There are wounds that time cannot heal, and loneliness that cuts deeper than any blade. Ingrid knows this truth well at 34. She has made peace with her empty home and the children she will never hold. The daughter of a disgraced healer teaches village children while her own hearth remains cold. Then Bjorn the Red returns from war, a giant warrior whose clan lies in ruins. He enters her home and speaks plainly. I need a wife and you need strong sons. What begins as necessity becomes something neither expected. Two broken souls must learn if love can grow from the ashes of their separate griefs. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like a shroud, and Ingrid, Eric's daughter, pulled her woolen cloak tighter as she made her way through the village of Ravensgard. Her leather satchel, worn smooth by years of carrying scrolls and writing materials, bounced gently against her hip with each measured step. The cobblestones beneath her feet were slick with dew, and the familiar scent of wood smoke and sea salt filled her nostrils, a combination that had defined every morning of her life for 34 years. The children would be waiting for her in the small stone building that served as their schoolhouse, their faces bright with curiosity despite the early hour. Teaching had become more than her livelihood. It was her sanctuary, the one place where her childless state felt like wisdom rather than failure. When young Astrid struggled with her letters, or when Eric, the blacksmith's son, finally grasped the concept of numbers, Ingrid felt a maternal satisfaction that was both balm and torment to her aching heart. She paused at the schoolhouse door, her hand resting on the iron latch that had been worn smooth by countless hands. Inside, she could hear the soft murmur of children's voices, and she took a deep breath before entering. 8 young faces turned toward her, their expressions ranging from eager to sleepy, and she felt the familiar warmth that came with being needed, even in this small way. "Good morning, little scholars," she said, setting her satchel on the wooden table that served as her desk. The morning light filtered through the single window, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn floor. Today we shall continue our study of the great sagas, and perhaps Magnus will finally remember that Thor's hammer is called Mjolnir, not the big hammer. A ripple of laughter passed through the room, and even Magnus grinned sheepishly. These moments of levity were precious to Ingrid, reminders that joy could still be found in simple things. She unrolled her teaching scroll, the parchment crackling softly in the morning quiet. The document was one of her most treasured possessions, a collection of lessons, stories, and wisdom that she had compiled over years of teaching. Its edges were worn from handling, and the ink had faded in places, but it represented everything she had to give to the world. As the children bent over their writing tablets, practicing their runes with varying degrees of success, Ingrid's mind wandered to her own childhood. Her father, Thorvald the healer, had once been one of the most respected men in Ravensgard. Villagers had come from neighboring settlements, seeking his knowledge of herbs and healing, and Ingrid had learned at his side, absorbing not just the properties of plants but the importance of observation, patience, and compassion. Everything had changed the winter she turned 16. The Jarl's wife had fallen ill with a fever that seemed beyond earthly remedy, and despite Thorvald's best efforts, she had died in the long dark of winter's heart. The Jarl, mad with grief, had accused Thorvald of incompetence or worse, deliberate sabotage. Though the accusations were groundless, the seeds of doubt had been planted. People began to whisper that Thorvald's healing had always carried a touch of something unnatural, something that walked too close to the old magic that the Christian priests condemned. The disgrace had followed Ingrid into her marriage with Leif Ragnarsson, a kind but unremarkable farmer who had seen past her father's tainted reputation to the intelligent, capable woman beneath. Their 5 years together had been peaceful, if not passionate, and Ingrid had allowed herself to hope that children would come in time. But time had brought only Leif's sudden death from a winter cough that turned to fever, leaving Ingrid alone. At 27, with nothing but a small cottage, a few coins, and the growing certainty that motherhood would remain forever beyond her reach. Now, 7 years later, she had built a life of quiet dignity around her loss. The villagers respected her learning and trusted her with their children, even if they sometimes looked at her with the mixture of pity and fear reserved for women who had been marked by misfortune. She had her small garden, her teaching, and her books, gifts from a traveling merchant who had recognized her hunger for knowledge. It was not the life she had once imagined, but it was hers, and she had learned to find peace within its boundaries. The morning passed quickly, as it always did when she was absorbed in teaching. The children practiced their letters, recited the multiplication tables she had painstakingly taught them, and listened with wide eyes as she told them stories of the old gods and heroes. When the sun reached its zenith, she dismissed them for their midday meal, watching fondly as they scattered like leaves in the wind, their voices carrying across the village square. Ingrid was gathering her materials when she heard the commotion outside. Horses' hooves on cobblestone, the jingle of mail, and the kind of excited murmur that meant something significant had happened. She stepped to the window and felt her breath catch in her throat. A group of warriors had entered the village square, their presence commanding immediate attention. Even travel-worn and dust-covered, they carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of men who had seen battle and emerged victorious. But it was their leader who drew every eye and held it captive. Bjorn Eriksson, Bjorn the Red, as he was known throughout the northern lands, sat his warhorse like a man born to command. Even seated, his massive frame was imposing, and his red-gold hair caught the sunlight like burnished copper. His face bore the weathered lines of a man who had spent years under foreign skies, and a jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a testament to battles fought in distant lands. Ingrid had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in the northern settlements knew of Bjorn the Red and his clan of warrior brothers. They had sailed south years ago, seeking glory and gold in the service of foreign kings, and their exploits had become the stuff of legend. But she also knew the darker tale, how Bjorn's clan had been betrayed and slaughtered, how he alone had survived to carry word of their deaths back to the homeland. Now he was here, in Ravsgard, and the weight of his presence seemed to settle over the village like a heavy cloak. The Jarl himself emerged from his hall, flanked by his guards, to greet the famous warrior. Ingrid watched from her window as the two men spoke, their conversation too distant to hear but their body language speaking volumes. There was tension there, respect mixed with wariness, the careful bands of powerful men who understood that alliances could shift like tides. She was about to turn away, when Bjorn's gaze swept across the square and came to rest on her window. Even from this distance, she could feel the intensity of his attention, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, their eyes met across the space that separated them. There was something in his expression, a measuring look, as if he were seeing not just her face, but something deeper, some quality that others had overlooked. Then the moment passed, and he was dismounting from his horse, his attention returning to the Jarl and the practical matters of arrival. But Ingrid remained at the window, her heart beating faster than it had in years, though she could not have said why. The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors to her cottage, each one eager to share what they had learned about Bjorn's return. Old Gunnar the fisherman claimed that Bjorn had come home to die, that the wounds from his last battle were slowly killing him. Astrid, the weaver, insisted that he was fleeing enemies who had followed him across the sea. The blacksmith's wife was certain that he had returned to claim the Jarl's daughter in marriage, though she had already been promised to another. Ingrid listened to it all with the patient attention she had learned to cultivate, offering non-committal responses that neither encouraged nor discouraged the flow of gossip. But privately, she found herself thinking of that moment when their eyes had met, and the strange certainty that had settled in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. As evening approached, and the last of her visitors departed, Ingrid set about preparing her simple supper. She had learned to find comfort in these domestic rituals: the careful selection of vegetables from her garden, the methodical preparation of bread and cheese, the brewing of herbal tea that filled her cottage with the scent of mint and chamomile. These small acts of self-care were how she marked the boundaries of her solitary life, creating order and meaning in the space that circumstances had carved out for her. She had just settled at her small table with her meal when the knock came. At her door, it was not the tentative tap of a neighbor or the urgent pounding of someone in need. This was the firm, measured knock of someone accustomed to having doors open for them, someone who expected to be heard and heeded. Ingrid set down her spoon and walked to the door, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She lifted the latch and pulled the heavy oak door open, and found herself looking up into the weathered face of Bjorn the Red. Up close, he was even more imposing than he had appeared from her window. He stood nearly a head taller than most men, his shoulders broad enough to block out the evening light, and his presence filled the doorway like a force of nature. His blue eyes, pale as winter ice, studied her face with an intensity that made her feel both exposed and strangely valued. "Ingrid Eric's daughter," he said, and his voice was exactly what she would have expected: deep, resonant, carrying the authority of a man who had commanded others in life-and-death situations. "I would speak with you." There was no question in his tone, no request for permission. He simply stated his intention as if her agreement were a foregone conclusion. Another woman might have bristled at such presumption, but Ingrid found herself stepping aside to let him enter, drawn by a curiosity stronger than her sense of propriety. He moved into her cottage with surprising grace for such a large man, his eyes taking in the details of her simple home: the neat stacks of scrolls, the dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the small loom where she wove the cloth that supplemented her teaching income. When his gaze fell on her teaching scroll, spread across the table where she had left it that morning, something shifted in his expression. "You can read," he said, and there was approval in his voice. "And write." "Yes," Ingrid replied, finding her voice at last. "My father taught me before." She stopped herself, unwilling to speak of her family's disgrace to this stranger, no matter how famous he might be. But Bjorn seemed to understand without explanation. Before the Jarl's wife died, and Thorvald, the healer, became Thorvald the Cursed. His voice held no judgment, merely acknowledgement of a fact. "I knew your father's reputation. His skill was real, whatever superstitious fools might say." The unexpected kindness in his words caught Ingrid off guard, and she felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. It had been years since anyone had spoken of her father with anything but whispered suspicion, and the simple validation meant more to her than she could express. "I need a wife," Bjorn said then, his words falling into the silence like stones into water. "And you need strong sons." The bluntness of his declaration should have offended her, but instead, Ingrid found herself studying his face, looking for the calculation she expected to find there. What she saw instead was exhaustion, bone-deep weariness that spoke of losses too great to measure and burdens too heavy to bear alone. "That is quite an assumption," she said carefully. "About what I need." A ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Is it? You are 34 years old, widowed, childless, and alone. Winter comes early in these lands, and it cares nothing for pride or independence. I offer protection, provision, and the prospect of children. In return, I ask for a home, a helpmate, and heirs to carry my name forward." His words were harsh in their practicality, but there was something in his manner that suggested he understood the weight of what he was proposing. This was not a man who took marriage lightly, nor one who expected love to bloom from convenience. He was offering a transaction, but one based on mutual need rather than mere exploitation. "Why me?" Ingrid asked. "There are younger women in the village, unmarried daughters who would bring dowries and alliances." "Because," Bjorn said, "and now." His pale eyes held hers without wavering. "I am 42 years old and tired of war. I have seen enough of beauty and youth destroyed by violence and hardship. I need a woman who understands loss, who knows the value of peace, and who will not expect me to be someone I am not. You have buried a husband and survived disgrace. You know what it means to endure." The honesty in his words was like a blow to the chest, painful in its accuracy, but somehow cleansing as well. He saw her clearly not as the failed woman the village pitied, but as someone who had been tested and proven strong. It was a gift she had not expected to receive, especially from a stranger who owed her nothing. "I will consider your proposal," she said at last, the words coming out steadier than she felt. "But I will not be rushed into a decision that will shape the rest of my life." Bjorn nodded, as if he had expected nothing less. 3 days, he said. "I will return in 3 days for your answer. Think well, Ingrid Eriksdottir. Winter is coming, and we are neither of us getting younger." With that, he turned and walked back to her door, pausing on the threshold to look back at her one last time. "Your father would be proud of the woman you have become," he said quietly. "Do not let the fears of small minds make you forget your own worth." Then he was gone, leaving Ingrid alone in her cottage with the echo of his words and the lingering scent of leather and steel that had accompanied his presence. She sank into her chair, her untouched supper growing cold before her, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. Outside, the evening shadows lengthened, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of children playing in the village square. Tomorrow they would come to her for lessons, their faces bright with trust and expectation, and she would teach them as she always had. But everything had changed in the space of a single conversation, and she knew that whatever decision she made in the next 3 days would alter the course of her life forever. The battle-worn cloakpin she had noticed on Bjorn's shoulder flashed. In her memory, a silver wolf, tarnished and dented, but still proud. Like its owner, it bore the marks of hard use, but had not been broken by its trials. Perhaps, she thought, there was something to be said for such endurance, for the strength that came not from avoiding hardship, but from meeting it head-on and refusing to yield. As the last light faded from the sky, Ingrid finally pushed her cold supper aside and reached for her teaching scroll. In its familiar weight and worn edges, she found the anchor she needed to steady herself against the storm of possibility that Bjorn's proposal had unleashed. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she would face it as she always had, with quiet dignity, careful thought, and the hard-won wisdom that came from surviving when surrender would have been easier. The future stretched before her like an uncharted sea, full of both promise and peril. But for the first time in years, Ingrid allowed herself to imagine that it might hold something more than mere survival. Perhaps it might even hold happiness, if she could find the courage to reach for it. 3 days had never felt so long or passed so quickly. Ingrid moved through her daily routines with mechanical precision, teaching her students, tending her garden, and preparing her meals, but her mind remained fixed on the choice that lay before her. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams of winter storms and empty hearths, of children's laughter and the weight of strong arms around her shoulders. The village buzzed with speculation about Bjorn's presence and his frequent visits to the Jarl's Hall. Some claimed he was seeking land to settle, others that he was merely resting before continuing to some distant destination. But Ingrid noticed how his men had begun making small repairs to the abandoned longhouse at the village's edge, and how Bjorn himself had visited the blacksmith to commission new household items. These were not the actions of a man planning to leave. On the morning of the 3rd day, Ingrid woke before dawn with her decision clear in her mind. She had weighed every argument, considered every possibility, and in the end, the choice came down to something simpler than logic or strategy. She was tired of being afraid of taking risks, afraid of hoping for more than survival, afraid of the judgment of people whose own lives were circumscribed by the same fears that had governed hers. When Bjorn arrived at her cottage that evening, she was ready for him. She had prepared a simple meal of bread, cheese, and ale, setting 2 places at her small table as if this were a normal social visit rather than a negotiation that would determine the course of their lives. "You have decided," he said as he entered, reading her preparedness like a runestone. "I have," Ingrid replied, gesturing for him to sit. "But first, we must speak plainly about what this arrangement will entail." Bjorn settled his large frame into the wooden chair, which creaked ominously under his weight. His pale eyes studied her face, and she could see him cataloging the subtle changes in her demeanor, the straighter posture, the steadier gaze, the absence of the nervous energy that had marked their first meeting. "Speak," he said simply. "I will not be treated as chattel or ornament," Ingrid began, her voice calm but firm. "I have managed my own affairs for 7 years, and I will continue to have a voice in decisions that affect our household." "Agreed." "I will continue teaching the village children. It is not merely work to me, it is part of who I am. The children need education. You provide it well. I will not be rushed into intimacy. If children are to come, they will come from mutual desire, not duty or schedule." At this, Bjorn's expression softened slightly. "I am not a young man driven by lust, Ingrid. I understand the difference between partnership and possession." She studied his face, looking for any sign of deception or hidden meaning, but found only steady sincerity. "Then yes," she said quietly, "I will marry you." The formal betrothal ceremony took place 2 days later in the village square, witnessed by the entire population of Ravensgard. Ingrid had expected to feel nervous or uncertain as she stood before the carved runestone that would formalize their union, but instead she felt oddly calm. The marriage contract stone, ancient and weathered, bore the symbols of countless unions that had come before theirs, and there was comfort in becoming part of that long tradition of practical alliances that had sustained their people through generations of hardship. Jarl Magnus presided over the ceremony, his voice carrying clearly across the square as he recited the traditional words that would bind them together. Ingrid wore her finest dress, deep blue wool with silver thread that caught the afternoon light, and Bjorn stood beside her in a clean tunic and his best cloak, the silver wolf pin gleaming on his shoulder. "Do you, Bjorn Eriksson, take this woman as your wife, to protect and provide for her according to the laws of our people?" "I do so swear," Bjorn replied, his deep voice steady and sure. "Do you, Ingrid Eriksdottir, take this man as your husband, to serve as his helpmate and bear his children according to the laws of our people?" Ingrid felt the weight of every eye in the village upon her, the mixture of curiosity, envy, and concern that followed her everywhere she went. But when she looked up at Bjorn's face, she saw something that gave her courage, not passion or romantic love, but a quiet respect that promised partnership rather than dominance. "I do so swear," she said, her voice carrying farther than she had expected. The ceremony concluded with the traditional exchange of rings, simple silver bands that Bjorn had commissioned from the village smith. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand was gentle but firm, and Ingrid felt the symbolic weight of commitment settling around her like a cloak. The villagers pressed forward with congratulations and well wishes, and Ingrid accepted their attentions with gracious dignity. But she noticed the subtle divisions in their responses, the older women who nodded approvingly at her practical choice, the younger ones who looked at her with a mixture of pity and envy, the men who clasped Bjorn's shoulder with the hearty camaraderie reserved for fellow warriors. That evening, as the sun set over the fjord, Ingrid gathered her few possessions and prepared to leave the cottage that had been her sanctuary for 7 years. Her belongings fit easily into 2 wooden chests, her teaching materials, her small collection of books, her best clothing, and the few items of sentimental value that connected her to her past. It seemed both too little and too much to represent. A lifetime of careful accumulation. Bjorn arrived with a cart to transport her things, accompanied by 2 of his men who treated the task with military efficiency. As they loaded her possessions, Ingrid took one last look around the cottage that had sheltered her through grief, loneliness, and the slow rebuilding of her life. The walls held the echo of countless quiet evenings, and the hearth had warmed her through more winters than she cared to count. "Are you ready?" Bjorn asked, his tone gentle enough to suggest that he understood the magnitude of what she was leaving behind. "As ready as one can be for such a change," Ingrid replied, pulling her cloak around her shoulders and stepping out into the evening air. The longhouse that would be her new home stood at the northern edge of the village, larger and more substantial than her cottage, but bearing the neglect of abandonment. Bjorn's men had worked hard to make it habitable. The roof had been repaired, the floors swept clean, and fresh rushes scattered to cover the worn wooden planks. But it still felt empty, lacking the accumulated warmth that came from years of loving occupation. "It will improve with time," Bjorn said, as if reading her thoughts. A house becomes a home through the lives lived within it. They shared their first meal as husband and wife at the long wooden table that dominated the main room, eating by the light of oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the walls. The conversation was awkward at first, both of them acutely aware of their new status and uncertain how to navigate the sudden intimacy of shared domestic space. "Tell me about your men," Ingrid said, seeking neutral ground. "Will they be staying long in Ravsgard?" "Some will move on when spring comes," Bjorn replied, cutting his bread with precise movements. "Others have decided to settle here permanently. War has a way of teaching men what they truly value, and many have grown tired of wandering. And you? Are you tired of wandering?" Bjorn was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the flickering flame of the nearest lamp. "I have seen enough of foreign shores and foreign battles," he said finally. "It is time to build something rather than destroy it." After supper, they faced the awkward question of sleeping arrangements. The longhouse had a separate sleeping chamber, smaller than the main room but furnished with a large bed that could easily accommodate 2 people. Ingrid stood in the doorway, suddenly conscious of her new status as a wife and all that it traditionally implied. "I can sleep by the fire," Bjorn said quietly, understanding her hesitation without need for explanation, "until you are comfortable with closer quarters." His consideration surprised her, though she realized it should not have. Everything about their arrangement had been based on mutual respect rather than passion or possession, and it made sense that he would extend that same courtesy to their most intimate spaces. "Thank you," she said, relief evident in her voice. "I think that would be best for now." She prepared for bed with the same careful routine she had followed for years, but everything felt different in this new space. The bed was larger and softer than her old one, the room warmer thanks to its proximity to the main hearth, and through the small window she could see a different slice of sky than the one that had watched over her cottage. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the longhouse settling around her, Ingrid reflected on the day's events. She was now a married woman again, bound to a man she barely knew but already respected. The future stretched before her, full of possibilities both thrilling and terrifying. From the main room, she could hear the soft sounds of Bjorn preparing his own makeshift bed by the fire. There was something comforting about knowing she was not alone in this large space, that another person shared the responsibility of keeping the darkness at bay. For the first time in years, she fell asleep to the sound of another person's breathing, and her dreams were filled not with empty rooms and cold hearths, but with the promise of warm bread and children's laughter echoing through rooms that had been brought back to life. The marriage contract stone had done its work, binding their lives together with the weight of tradition and mutual need. But as sleep claimed her, Ingrid allowed herself to hope that time might build something deeper on that practical foundation, not the passionate love of youth, but the steady warmth of partnership between two people who had learned to value what truly mattered in life. The first weeks of marriage brought a careful dance of adjustment as Ingrid and Bjorn learned to navigate their shared space and intertwined lives. Each morning, Ingrid woke to find that Bjorn had already risen and built up the fire, leaving her bedroom warm against the autumn chill. He would be outside when she emerged, checking on the repairs his men were making to the outbuildings or discussing plans for the coming winter with the village craftsmen. Their conversations remained polite and practical discussions of household needs, village news, and the logistics of preparing for the harsh season ahead. But beneath the surface courtesy, Ingrid sensed a growing familiarity, the comfortable ease that came from sharing daily routines with someone whose presence gradually shifted from strange to expected. The longhouse itself began to reflect their combined influences. Ingrid's teaching scrolls found their place alongside Bjorn's weapons on the wooden shelves, and her small collection of healing herbs joined his practical supplies in the storage alcoves. The space that had felt hollow and unwelcoming on her first night slowly filled with the accumulated evidence of two lives learning to merge. Her morning routine expanded to include preparing breakfast for two, a task that required more planning than her previous solitary meals. Bjorn ate with the efficient appetite of a man accustomed to uncertain provisions, never complaining about simple fare, but expressing genuine appreciation for touches like fresh bread or herbed eggs from her small flock of chickens. "You have a gift for making simple food taste like a feast," he said one morning, watching her add dried rosemary to the porridge that would sustain him through a day of heavy labor. "My mother taught me that every meal should be prepared with intention," Ingrid replied, stirring the pot with steady strokes. "Food made with care nourishes more than the body." She had not spoken of her mother in years. The woman had died when Ingrid was barely 16, another loss in a life that seemed marked by premature endings. But something about the domestic intimacy of preparing meals for her husband brought back memories of watching her mother work in their old kitchen, learning the small arts that transform necessity into comfort. The village children continued to come for their lessons, though now they gathered in the main room of the longhouse rather than the small schoolhouse. The change in venue seemed to energize them, and Ingrid suspected it had more to do with the possibility of glimpsing the famous Bjorn the Red than with any improvement in the accommodations. Bjorn himself seemed surprised by their presence at first, clearly unaccustomed to having his space invaded by the chatter and energy of young voices. But Ingrid noticed how he would pause in his morning preparations to listen to the lessons, his weathered face thoughtful as she guided the children through their letters and numbers. One morning, as she struggled to help young Olaf grasp the concept of multiplication, Bjorn stepped forward from his position by the door. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the child's writing tablet. Ingrid nodded, curious to see how a warrior would approach the challenge of education. Bjorn knelt beside Olaf's stool, his massive frame folding itself down to the child's level with surprising grace. "Multiplication is like organizing warriors for battle," he said, his deep voice taking on the patient tone of a teacher. "If you have 3 groups of 4 men each, how many warriors do you command?" Olaf's eyes widened with interest. Warfare was far more engaging than abstract numbers, and within minutes, he had grasped the concept that had eluded him for weeks. The other children gathered around, fascinated by this new perspective on their lessons, and Ingrid found herself watching with growing admiration as Bjorn answered their eager questions with the same serious attention he would give to adult concerns. "You are good with them," she said later, after the children had departed for their midday meal. "They are not so different from young recruits," Bjorn replied, cleaning his hands at the wash basin. "They need clear guidance and respect for their efforts. Most learn quickly when they understand the purpose behind the lesson." The collection of healing herbs that Ingrid had brought from her cottage became her mother's legacy in action. She had inherited not just the dried plants themselves, but the knowledge of their uses, which one soothed fever, which helped with pain, which could ease the troubled sleep that came from old wounds and older memories. When Bjorn returned one evening with a fresh cut on his forearm from a mishap with his axe, Ingrid cleaned and dressed the wound with competent hands, mixing a poultice of comfrey and honey to promote healing. "You have your father's skill," Bjorn observed, watching her work with the focused attention. She had learned to associate with his assessment of anything new or potentially useful. "My mother's, actually," Ingrid corrected gently. "She taught me the healing arts before my father took over my education. The village has forgotten that women held this knowledge long before men claimed it." She felt his gaze on her face as she wrapped the clean linen around his arm. And when she looked up, she saw something new in his expression, not just respect for her competence, but recognition of the person behind the skill. "The village forgets many things that should be remembered," he said quietly. "Perhaps it is time for some of that knowledge to be restored." As the day shortened and the first frost touched the village, Ingrid began to see glimpses of the man beneath Bjorn's warrior exterior. He suffered from nightmares that left him restless and wakeful in the early morning hours, and she would sometimes find him sitting by the banked fire, staring into the glowing coals with eyes that saw scenes from battles fought on distant shores. He never spoke of these dreams directly, but she began to understand that his return to Ravsgard was not just a homecoming, but a retreat from memories too painful to carry alone. The destruction of his clan, his brothers in arms, who had shared his exile and fought beside him through years of foreign wars, had left wounds that went deeper than flesh. One particularly cold morning, she found him outside before dawn, practicing sword forms in the pale light that preceded sunrise. His movements were fluid and precise, each strike and parry executed with the unconscious perfection that came from years of training. But there was something almost desperate in his intensity, as if he were fighting opponents that existed only in his mind. "Could you not sleep?" she asked, wrapping her cloak around herself as she approached. Bjorn completed his current sequence before turning to face her, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. "Old habits," he said, though she could see the tension in his shoulders that spoke of something more than routine. "My father used to say that the body remembers what the mind tries to forget," Ingrid said carefully. "Sometimes the only cure is to let the memories come rather than fighting them." For a moment she thought he might speak, his mouth opened slightly, and she saw something vulnerable flicker across his features. But then his warrior's mask reasserted itself, and he nodded curtly before sheathing his sword. "Breakfast?" he asked, as if the conversation had been about nothing more significant than the weather. But as they walked back to the longhouse together, Ingrid noticed that his hand briefly touched her shoulder, a gesture so fleeting she might have imagined it, but one that suggested her words had been heard and perhaps even welcomed. The rhythm of their shared life continued to evolve, marked by small moments of connection that accumulated like coins in a purse. When Bjorn returned from meetings with the Jarl or consultations with other villagers, he began to share details of the discussions, asking her opinion on matters of village governance or seasonal planning, treating her thoughts with the same consideration he would give to counsel from his most trusted advisors. In return, Ingrid found herself opening to him about her own concerns and observations. She told him about the village children who showed particular promise, about the older residents whose health worried her, about the small dramas and celebrations that wove the fabric of community life. They were becoming partners in truth, not just in name. learning to value each other's strengths and compensate for each other's limitations. It was not the passionate romance of youth, but something perhaps more valuable, a foundation of mutual respect and growing affection that promised to weather the storms that life inevitably brought. The wooden training sword that Bjorn had carved in the evenings became a symbol of this new direction in his life. Unlike the battle-tested weapons that hung on their walls, this practice blade was a tool of creation rather than destruction. She had watched him work on it during the long twilight hours, his large hands surprisingly delicate as he shaped and smoothed the oak into a perfect replica of a warrior's sword. For the boys in the village, he had explained when she asked about his project. They should learn proper form from the beginning, not develop bad habits swinging sticks. But Ingrid suspected there was more to it than practical instruction. In crafting something meant to teach rather than harm, Bjorn was perhaps teaching himself that his skills could build as well as destroy, that the strength in his hands could nurture as well as defend. The evening he presented the finished sword. To young Eric, the blacksmith's son, Ingrid saw a glimpse of the father Bjorn might become. He knelt beside the boy, adjusting his grip and stance with infinite patience, his deep voice gentle as he explained the importance of balance and control. A sword is not just a weapon, he told the wide-eyed child. It is a responsibility. Every time you pick it up, you must remember that strength without wisdom is destruction, and wisdom without strength cannot protect what you love. Watching from the doorway, Ingrid felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth behind her. This was not the brutal warrior of legend, but a man capable of profound gentleness, someone who understood that true strength lay not in the ability to inflict harm, but in the choice to use power wisely. As autumn deepened toward winter, their physical proximity began to carry new weight. The practical necessities of shared space passing each other in the narrow corridors, reaching for the same items. The unavoidable moments when their hands touched as they worked together took on a subtle charge that neither acknowledged directly but both felt. One evening, as they sat together preparing vegetables for the next day's stew, Ingrid became acutely aware of Bjorn's presence beside her. His shoulder brushed hers as he reached for another onion, and she caught the scent that she had come to associate with him: leather and wool, the lingering smoke from the smithy where he spent his mornings, and something indefinably masculine that made her breath catch. When he looked up and found her watching him, neither of them looked away immediately. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility and the growing awareness that their careful partnership was evolving into something deeper and more complex. Ingrid, he said, and her name on his lips sounded different than it had before, softer, more intimate, carrying weight she had not heard since Leif had spoken it in the early days of their marriage. But before either could explore what that moment might mean, a commotion outside broke the spell. Shouts echoed across the village, and the sound of running feet on cobblestones suggested some kind of emergency. Bjorn was on his feet instantly, his warrior's instincts overriding any personal considerations. He strapped on his sword and threw his cloak over his shoulders, pausing only long enough to look back at Ingrid with eyes that held both regret for the interrupted moment and concern for her safety. "Stay here," he said, though it was more request than command. "Bar the door until I return." Ingrid nodded, but as soon as he disappeared into the night, she found herself unable to simply wait. She pulled on her own cloak and stepped outside, drawn by the same curiosity that had always made her a good teacher, the need to understand what was happening in her world. The disturbance proved to be raiders from a neighboring settlement, young men seeking easy plunder from what they assumed would be a defenseless village. They had not counted on Bjorn's presence or the military efficiency with which he organized the village's defense. From her position near the longhouse, Ingrid watched her husband transform into the warrior of legend. His movements were swift and decisive, his commands clear and immediately obeyed. Within moments, he had the village men positioned strategically, turning their familiar streets into tactical advantages that the raiders had not anticipated. The skirmish was brief, but decisive. The would-be raiders, faced with organized resistance, led by a man whose reputation had reached even their remote settlement, withdrew quickly and did not return. But the incident served as a reminder that their peaceful existence was fragile, dependent on the strength and vigilance of those willing to defend it. When Bjorn returned to the longhouse, his sword clean, but his eyes still alert with the aftermath of violence, Ingrid was waiting for him with clean water and soft cloth to tend the minor cuts he had sustained. "You should have stayed inside," he said, but there was no real reproach in his voice, only the weary concern of a man who had seen too much of what the world could do to those he cared about. "I needed to see," Ingrid replied, carefully cleaning a shallow slice across his knuckles. "This is my village too, my home. I will not hide from its realities." As she worked, she felt the tension gradually leave his shoulders, the warrior's alertness fading back into the gentler man she had come to know. When she finished with his wounds, she did not immediately step away, and neither did he. They stood, close together in the lamplight, connected by the shared understanding that they had both been tested this night. He in battle, she in her willingness to face danger rather than retreat into comfortable ignorance. "We make a good team," Bjorn said quietly, and in those simple words, Ingrid heard the acknowledgement of something that had been building between them for weeks, a partnership that was becoming something deeper, richer, and more complete than either had expected when they first agreed to their practical arrangement. The future remained uncertain, full of challenges they could not yet foresee. But as they prepared for bed that night, moving around each other with the practiced ease of true companions, Ingrid felt a quiet satisfaction in what they were building together. It might not be the passionate love of story and song, but it was real, solid, and growing stronger with each day. They chose to trust each other a little more. Winter's approach brought new intimacies born of necessity. The longhouse, spacious enough during the mild autumn days, felt smaller as the cold drove them indoors for longer periods. Ingrid found herself sharing closer quarters with Bjorn, their separate spheres of activity gradually overlapping as the shortened days compressed their routines dawed. It was during one of these long evenings that she first witnessed the full extent of Bjorn's struggles with his past. She had been mending one of his tunics by lamplight when a sudden crash of thunder, the first winter storm, arriving with unexpected violence, sent him bolting upright from his place by the fire. His hand went immediately to where his sword would normally rest, his eyes wild with the look of a man expecting attack. "Bjorn," she said softly, setting aside her sewing. "You are safe. You are home." It took several moments for recognition to return to his eyes, and when it did, shame followed close behind. He sank back down, running his hands through his red gold hair with fingers that trembled slightly. "I apologize," he said, his voice rough. "The dreams, sometimes they bleed into the waking world." Rather than retreat to give him privacy in his vulnerability, Ingrid moved closer, settling beside him on the bench near the fire. "Tell me about them," she said quietly. "My father used to say that wounds fester when kept in darkness." For a long moment, Bjorn stared into the flames, his profile harsh in the flickering light. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one cost him something precious. "We were ambushed in a narrow valley, miles from any help. My cousin Eric, my own blood, had sold our position to our enemies for silver and promises of land. 23 men I had called brothers, gone in a single morning. I hear their voices in the thunder, see their faces in the shadows." The simple recounting held depths of anguish that made Ingrid's own losses seem small by comparison. To lose family was one kind of grief. To lose them to betrayal by one's own kin was another entirely. How did you survive? She asked, though. She wasn't certain she wanted to know the answer. I was scouting ahead when the attack came. By the time I fought my way back to them, it was too late. Eric stood over Olaf's body. Olaf, who had been like a younger brother to both of us, and when he saw me, he smiled. He actually smiled. Bjorn's hands clenched into fists, and Ingrid could see the effort it took for him to continue. I killed him then, my own cousin, my childhood companion. But it brought no peace, no justice. The dead remained dead, and I was left with the knowledge that blood means nothing when weighed against greed. The storm outside seemed to echo his words, wind and rain lashing against the longhouse walls as if seeking entry. Ingrid reached out without thinking, placing her hand over his clenched fist. The contact was warm and solid, an anchor in the tempest of memory. "You carry their deaths as if they were your fault," she said gently. "But betrayal is the betrayer's sin, not yours. I should have seen it coming. Should have read the signs, protected them better. And I should have been able to heal my husband's fever. Should have recognized the signs of his illness before it was too late. Should have, could have. These words are chains we forge for ourselves, Bor. They bind us to the past and prevent us from living in the present." Her words seemed to reach something deep within him, and gradually his fists unclenched. His hand turned palm up beneath hers, and their fingers intertwined with natural ease. "How do you find peace with it?" he asked. "The knowing that you failed someone you loved?" "By remembering that love itself is not failure," Ingrid replied. "Leif knew he was loved every day of our marriage. Your brothers knew they had a leader who would have died for them. That knowledge goes with them into whatever comes after, and it should comfort us as well." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn lower as the storm gradually exhausted itself outside. When Bjorn finally spoke again, his voice was steadier. "I drink too much," he said abruptly. "When the memories become overwhelming, it is not a weakness one I'm proud of." The admission clearly cost him, this proud warrior acknowledging a flaw that went beyond the physical. Ingrid had noticed the empty ale cups, the way he sometimes sought the oblivion that strong drink could provide, but she had not commented on it. Now she understood it was another symptom of wounds that ran deeper than flesh. "Then we shall work together to find better remedies," she said practically. "My mother's knowledge included treatments for troubled sleep and haunted minds. Perhaps it is time to put that learning to use." The next morning brought clearer skies and a subtle shift in their relationship. Bjorn seemed surprised to wake and find that his revelations of the night before had not driven Ingrid away, and she found herself moving around their shared space with greater ease, as if some barrier between them had been lowered. When the village children arrived for their lessons, Bjorn did not retreat to his usual corner, but remained near the fire, listening openly to the instruction. When young Magnus struggled with a particularly difficult passage from the old stories, Bjorn quietly corrected a mispronunciation, his voice gentle enough that the boy felt helped rather than criticized. "You could help me teach them," Ingrid suggested during their midday meal. "The old stories, the history of our people, you have lived more of it than most." "I am not learned like you," Bjorn protested. "I can barely scratch out my own name." "Then it is time you learn properly," Ingrid said decisively. "Knowledge is not the province of any single class of people. A warrior who can read and write is twice as valuable as one who cannot." That afternoon, she began his education in earnest, starting with the basic runes and gradually building toward more complex writing. Bjorn proved to be a surprisingly apt pupil, his warrior's discipline serving him well in mastering new skills. He approached learning with the same methodical determination he brought to combat training, practicing each letter until it was perfect before moving on to the next. "You have good hands for this work," Ingrid observed, watching him carefully. "Form the runes that spelled his name, steady and precise. They have had to be steady for other purposes, Bjorn replied, but there was no darkness in his tone now. Perhaps it is time they learned gentler skills. As winter deepened and the longest nights settled over Ravsgard, their evening routine evolved to include these teaching sessions. By lamplight, with the fire crackling nearby and the wind howling outside, Ingrid guided Bjorn through increasingly complex texts while he helped her prepare the next day's lessons. For the village children, it was during one of these quiet evenings that they first shared the same bed, not from passion, but from the practical necessity of warmth. A particularly fierce blizzard had driven the temperature so low that even their well-built longhouse struggled to maintain heat, and Ingrid woke shivering despite her heavy wool blankets. The fire has died down. Bjorn's voice came from the main room, rough with sleep and concern. I can rebuild it, Ingrid called back, though her teeth were chattering. There is a simpler solution, Bjorn said, and she heard the careful neutrality in his tone. If you would not be uncomfortable sharing warmth. The proposal was practical, sensible, and completely terrifying. But as another gust of wind rattled the shutters and sent cold air through every crack in the walls, practicality won over propriety. That would be appreciated, she managed, and within moments she heard his footsteps approaching her chamber. Bjorn entered with the same respectful caution he showed her in all things, bringing extra blankets and moving with deliberate care to avoid any suggestion of impropriety. But when they finally settled together under the heavy furs, Ingrid discovered that his large frame radiated heat like a forge, and for the first time in hours, she felt truly warm. Better? He asked quietly, and she could hear the smile in his voice. Much, she admitted, allowing herself to relax against the solid warmth of his chest. They lay quietly together, listening to the storm rage outside their walls, and Ingrid found herself thinking that this simple sharing of warmth and comfort might be more intimate than passion. There was trust here, and tenderness, and the growing certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Spring arrived late that year, but when it finally came, it brought changes that transformed everything. The first sign was subtle. Ingrid found herself unable to stomach the morning porridge that had sustained her through the winter months. The scent that had once been comforting now sent her rushing outside to empty her stomach in the kitchen. Bjorn noticed immediately, his warrior's eye trained to observe any deviation from normal patterns. Are you ill? He asked, concern evident in his voice as he found her kneeling among the early herbs, pale and shaking. I think, Ingrid began, then stopped, afraid to voice the possibility that had been growing in her mind for several days. I think I may be with child. The words hung in the morning air between them, carrying weight that seemed to alter the very foundation of their relationship. Bjorn went completely still, his face cycling through expressions of wonder, joy, and something that might have been terror before settling into the carefully neutral mask he wore when processing significant information. Are you certain? He asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. As certain as I can be without more time passing, Ingrid replied, accepting his steadying hand as she rose to her feet. The signs are all there, the sickness, the exhaustion, the changes in my body that I recognize from. She stopped, unwilling to mention her first marriage and the children who would never come. But Bjorn understood without explanation. His large hands came up to frame her face with infinite gentleness, and she saw tears gathering in his pale eyes. After so many years of believing it impossible, she whispered, her own voice breaking, I had made peace with childlessness, built my life around that absence. And now everything changes, Bjorn finished, and his voice held the same mixture of joy and fear that she felt. We will need to prepare, to ensure you have everything required for. He stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of impending fatherhood. The village women confirmed Ingrid's suspicions within days, their experienced eyes reading the signs she had barely dared to acknowledge. The news spread through Ravensgard like wildfire, bringing congratulations, advice, and the particular kind of attention the pregnant women attracted in communities where every new life was precious. "You must rest more," insisted Astrid the weaver, settling herself in Ingrid's main room with the air of someone preparing for a long visit. "And eat more red meat, it strengthens the blood." "Nonsense," countered old Gudrun, who had helped deliver half the children in the village. "What she needs is fresh air and gentle exercise. Sitting around like an invalid helps no one." Ingrid listened to the conflicting advice with patient good humor, but privately she found herself both grateful for the community's investment in her welfare and exhausted by their constant attention. Every woman in Ravensgard seemed to have strong opinions about pregnancy, childbirth, and child-rearing, and most were eager to share them at length. Bjorn, meanwhile, was transforming before her eyes. The careful restraint that had characterized their early relationship gave way to an almost overwhelming protectiveness that manifested in countless small gestures. He insisted on lifting anything heavier than a cooking pot, monitored her food intake with the intensity of a military quartermaster, and began approaching every aspect of their life with the strategic planning of a campaign. "We will need a larger cradle," he announced one evening, looking up from the piece of oak he had been studying with the concentration usually reserved for battle plans. "And additional blankets, soft wool for swaddling, herbs for the birthing." "Born," Ingrid interrupted gently, placing her hand over his where it rested on the table. "The child will not arrive tomorrow. We have months to prepare." But even as she spoke, she understood his need to take action. For a man accustomed to controlling his environment through strength and strategy, the relative helplessness of waiting for a child to develop and be born must have been almost unbearable. Planning and preparing were the only ways he could channel his protective instincts into useful activity. The wooden cradle he crafted became a work of art, carved with intricate patterns that told the story of their family's heritage. He worked on it in the evenings by lamplight, his large hands surprisingly delicate as they shaped the oak into flowing curves and protective walls. Watching him work, Ingrid saw the transformation of a destroyer into a creator, a warrior learning to build rather than tear down. "It is beautiful," she said one night, running her fingers along the smooth wood that would soon hold their child. "The baby will be safe here." "Safe," Bjorn repeated, and she heard layers of meaning in that single word. This child would have the protection that his fallen brothers had been denied, the security that came from being wanted and planned for and loved before birth. Their physical relationship deepened naturally as Ingrid's pregnancy progressed. The careful distance they had maintained through the winter months gave way to an intimacy, born from shared wonder at the life growing within her. Bjorn would place his large hands on her gradually expanding belly, his face filled with amazement when he felt the first tentative movements of their child. "Strong," he said with satisfaction, feeling a particularly vigorous kick. "This one will be a fighter." "Or a dancer," Ingrid suggested with amusement, determined to practice from the earliest possible moment. The threads on her loom began to reflect their changed circumstances as well. The tapestry she had been weaving gradually transformed from abstract patterns to something that told the story of their joining two separate designs that gradually merged into a unified whole, stronger and more beautiful than either could have been alone. Each evening, as she worked by the firelight, Bjorn would sit nearby, sometimes reading from the scrolls she had taught him to decipher, sometimes simply watching her hands move the shuttle back and forth with hypnotic rhythm. "What will you call the child?" asked young Astrid during one of the daily lessons that continued despite Ingrid's changing condition. "We have not decided," Ingrid replied, though privately she and Bjorn had spent many evenings discussing names. weighing the merits of honoring ancestors against the desire to give their child an identity all their own. If it is a boy, he should be called after a great warrior, declared Magnus with the certainty of youth, like his father. And if it is a girl, Ingrid asked, smiling at the boy's assumption. Then she should be called after a wise woman, said little Thora, shooting Magnus a look that suggested she found his priorities questionable, like her mother. The exchange warmed Ingrid's heart in ways she had not expected. These children, who had been her students and surrogate family for years, were now preparing to welcome her actual child into their community. The continuity of generations, the passing of knowledge and love from one to the next, felt more real and precious than it ever had before. But with joy came fear, the inevitable companion of hope in a world where so many things could go wrong. Ingrid tried not to dwell on the dangers of childbirth, the possibility of losing the baby or her own life in the process. But the fears crept in during quiet moments when her defenses were down. One evening, as she sat by the fire working on tiny clothes for the coming baby, the reality of what lay ahead overwhelmed her. The tears came without warning, silent streams that spoke of terror too deep for words. Bjorn was beside her instantly, his arms encircling her with protective warmth. "What troubles you?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "What if something goes wrong?" she whispered against his chest. "What if I lose the baby?" Or she could not voice the other possibility, the one that haunted the dreams of every expectant mother. "Then we will face it together," Bjorn said simply, "as we have faced everything else. But do not borrow tomorrow's sorrows, Ingrid. Today, the child is healthy and strong. Today, you are well and safe. Let that be enough." His steady calm anchored her, reminding her that she was not facing the future alone. Whatever came, they would meet it as partners, bound together by more than law or convenience, now bound by love, by hope, and by the precious life they had created together. As summer deepened and her pregnancy became more apparent, Ingrid found herself changing in ways that went beyond the physical. The careful reserve she had maintained since Leif's death was gradually giving way to a warmth and openness that surprised even her. She laughed more easily, spoke more freely of her hopes and dreams, and allowed herself to imagine a future filled with children's voices and the comfortable chaos of family life. The loom threads continued to weave their story, creating a tapestry that would serve as both art and history for the child to come. In its patterns, future generations would read the tale of two people who had found each other across the darkness of loss and built something beautiful from the fragments of their separate griefs. The child came too early and too silently on. A rain-soaked morning in late summer, when the air itself seemed heavy with unshed grief. Ingrid woke to cramping pain and the terrible wetness that meant her body was rejecting the life it had nurtured for barely 5 months. By the time Bjorn returned from his morning rounds of the village defenses, it was over. He found her sitting on the edge of their bed, holding the tiny, perfectly formed infant who would never draw breath. The child was so small that it fit entirely in her cupped palms, but every finger and toe was there, every feature delicately carved as if by the most skilled artisan. In another world, under different circumstances, this would have been there. Sunfur was indeed a boy, just as Bjorn had predicted. Ingrid, Bjorn's voice broke on her name, and she looked up to see tears streaming down his weathered face. This giant of a man, who had faced armies and buried his brothers in arms, was undone by the sight of their lost child. "He is perfect," she whispered, her own voice strangely calm in the face of devastation. "Look at his hands, Bjorn. He has your hands." Bjorn knelt beside the bed, his large fingers gently touching the infant's tiny palm with reverence typically reserved for sacred relics. "He would have been strong," he said, his voice barely audible. "A warrior, like his father. Or a scholar, Like his mother, Ingrid replied, completing the conversation they had imagined having someday in a future that would now never come. The village women came to help with the necessities, cleaning, preparing the small body for burial, offering the practical comfort that their community provided in times of loss. But their well-meaning presence felt intrusive to Ingrid, who wanted only to hold her son a little longer before accepting the finality of goodbye. Old Gudrun, who had delivered more babies than anyone could count, spoke with the blunt kindness of experience. It happens sometimes, child. The body knows when something is not right, and it protects itself the only way it can. You are young yet and healthy. There will be other children. But Ingrid barely heard the words. All her attention was focused on memorizing every detail of the child. She would never watch grow up, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the perfect curve of his tiny ears, the impossibly small fingernails that would never need cutting. The perfect curve of his tiny ears, the impossibly small fingernails that would never need cutting. The burial took place at sunset in the small graveyard overlooking the fjord. Bjorn had carved a marker from the same oak he had used for the cradle, simple but beautiful, bearing the child's name Magnus after the great king. Though this Magnus would never rule anything but their heart's dot as the earth closed over their son's grave, Ingrid felt something fundamental break inside her chest. The hope that had sustained her through months of preparation, the joy that had transformed her cautious existence into something rich with possibility, crumbled like ash in the wind. The days that followed passed in a blur of gray numbness. Ingrid went through the motions of daily life, preparing meals, tending the garden, teaching the village children, but she felt disconnected from it all, as if she were watching someone else's life from a great distance. Bjorn struggled with his own grief while trying to support hers. She would sometimes find him standing in the doorway of what should have been the nursery, staring at the empty cradle with eyes that held the same desolation she felt. His attempts at comfort were gentle but awkward, as if he were afraid that any touch might shatter what remained of her fragile composure. "Perhaps we should put it away," he suggested one morning, gesturing toward the cradle that dominated the corner of their sleeping chamber. No, Ingrid said sharply, the first strong emotion she had shown since the miscarriage. Not yet. She could not explain why the empty cradle comforted rather than tormented her. Perhaps it was the only tangible proof that their child had existed, that their brief hope had been real rather than imagined. Or perhaps she simply was not ready to accept that the future they had planned was truly gone. The village children sensed her sorrow and treated her with unusual gentleness. During their lessons, even the most boisterous among them spoke softly in her presence, and she often caught them watching her with the solemn concern that children show when the adults in their world are suffering. "Will you have another baby?" young Thora asked one afternoon with the directness that only children could manage. "I do not know," Ingrid replied honestly. "Sometimes these things are not ours to decide." The question haunted her long after the children had gone home. Would she risk this pain again? Could she bear to hope for another child, knowing how completely that hope could be destroyed? The uncertainty felt almost worse than the grief itself, thought it. Was Bjorn who finally spoke the words that had been hovering unspoken between them. They were sitting by the fire after another day of careful politeness and mutual avoidance of difficult topics when he set aside the piece of wood he had been carving and turned to face her directly. "This is killing us both," he said quietly. "Not just the loss of the child, but the way we are carrying that loss. We have stopped talking, stopped touching, stopped being partners in anything but name." Ingrid looked up from her needlework, startled by his directness. In the weeks since the miscarriage, they had been like polite strangers sharing the same house, each afraid to burden the other with the full weight of their sorrow. "I do not know how to grieve with you," she admitted. "My first instinct is to retreat, to protect myself from further pain. But that leaves you alone with your own grief, and that seems cruel. And I do not know how to comfort you without feeling like I am minimizing what you have lost, Bjorn replied. The child lived inside your body, was part of you in a way he never could be part of me. How can I claim equal ownership of this sorrow? The honesty in his words broke through the wall of numbness that had surrounded Ingrid's heart for weeks. Tears came then, not the silent streams she had shed in private, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from her very soul. Bjorn was beside her instantly, pulling her against his chest with the same protective instinct that had marked their entire relationship. But now there was desperation in his embrace, as if he feared that grief might steal her away as completely as it had taken their child. I wanted him so much, she gasped between sobs. I had given up hoping for children. Years ago, made peace with that emptiness. And then he came, and suddenly I could see our whole future watching him take his first steps, teaching him to read, seeing him grow into the man he might have been. Now all of that is gone, and I feel like I am mourning not just what was, but everything that will never be. I know, Bjorn whispered against her hair. I know, because I feel it too. I had already begun planning his training, imagining the stories I would tell him about his heritage, dreaming of the day he would be old enough to understand why his father's clan mattered. I was ready to be the father I never had the chance to be to my younger brothers. They held each other and wept for all of it, for Magnus, for the future that would not come, for the innocent joy that had been stolen from them before it could fully bloom. But somehow, in sharing their grief, instead of carrying it alone, they began to find their way back to each other. I do not want to try again, Ingrid said eventually, when the worst of the storm had passed. Not yet. I am not strong enough to risk this pain again so soon. Then we will not try, Bjorn replied without hesitation. We will take time to heal, to remember who we are beyond this loss. And if the time comes when you feel ready to hope again, we will face that decision together. His acceptance of her limits, his willingness to wait for her healing without pressure or resentment, reminded Ingrid why she had come to love this complicated man. In a world where women's value was often measured solely by their ability to bear children, Bjorn saw her as complete in herself, worthy of patience and respect regardless of what her body could or could not provide. The weeks that followed were marked by small steps toward healing. They began talking again, not just about practical matters, but about their feelings, their fears, and their memories of the brief time when their future had seemed so bright with possibility. Bjorn shared stories of his own losses, helping Ingrid understand that grief was not a weakness to be overcome, but a testament to the depth of love. My brother Olaf used to say that sorrow and joy were twin sisters. He told her one evening as they worked together in the garden, planting herbs. To the coming winter, one could not exist without the other, and both were necessary parts of a life fully lived. He sounds wise, Ingrid said, carefully spacing the rows of winter sage. He was barely 20 when he died, Bjorn replied. Sometimes wisdom comes early to those who will not have long to use it. The empty cradle remained in their sleeping chamber, but gradually it ceased to be a source of pure pain and became instead a memorial to possibility. Ingrid would sometimes find herself standing beside it, not with the crushing sorrow of the early days, but with a quieter sadness that felt more like acceptance. One morning, she woke to find that Bjorn had placed a single white stone in the cradle, smooth and perfect, worn by countless tides. It was beautiful in its simplicity, a placeholder for the child who would always be part of their story, even though his chapter had been heartbreakingly brief. For Magnus, Bjorn said simply when she questioned him about it later. So he is not forgotten. The gesture touched her deeply. This acknowledgement that their son deserved to be remembered, even if he had never lived to make memories of his own. It marked the beginning of their true healing, not the forgetting of their loss. but the integration of it into the larger tapestry of their shared life died as autumn approached and the village prepared for another winter. Ingrid found herself able to take pleasure in small things again. The laughter of her students no longer felt like mockery of her childless state, but like the natural joy of young life that would always deserve celebration. The warmth of Bjorn's hand in hers as they walked together through the village spoke not of what they had lost, but of what they still had. "We are different people than we were before," she observed one evening as they sat by the fire, both reading from scrolls in comfortable silence. "Different, but not broken," Bjorn agreed, looking up from his text with eyes that held hard-won peace. "Scarred, perhaps, but scars are proof of healing, not failure." The carved cradle remained in their room, a beautiful reminder that love did not require fulfillment to be real. And if sometimes Ingrid still dreamed of children's voices echoing through their home, she no longer woke from those dreams with despair. Instead, she carried them as gifts, glimpses of what might yet be, or simply precious imaginings that honored the love she and Bjorn had discovered in each other. They had survived their greatest test not by avoiding pain, but by choosing to face it together. In doing so, they had learned that their partnership was strong enough to weather even the deepest sorrow, and wise enough to find meaning in loss without being destroyed by it. The messenger arrived on a morning when frost painted the fjord silver and the air carried the sharp promise of winter's return. Ingrid was in the kitchen garden, harvesting the last of the root vegetables before the ground froze, when she heard the sound of a horse being ridden hard across the village square. The urgency in the hoofbeats made her straighten, her hands still full of turnips, as she watched a travel-worn rider dismount near the Jarl's hall. Bjorn emerged from the smithy, where he had been working on winter preparations, his face immediately alert to the possibility of trouble. Ingrid watched him cross the square with the purposeful stride of a man accustomed to responding quickly to unexpected developments. Whatever news the messenger brought, it was significant enough to require immediate attention from the village's most experienced warrior. She continued her work, but part of her attention remained fixed on the small cluster of men gathered around the messenger. Their body language spoke of serious discussion, and she noticed how several villagers had begun to drift toward the group with the casual curiosity that masked genuine concern. When Bjorn returned to their longhouse an hour later, his expression was grim in a way she had not seen since the early days of their marriage. He moved with the controlled tension of a man preparing for battle, and his first action was to check that his weapons were within easy reach. "What news?" Ingrid asked, setting aside her basket of vegetables. "Trouble coming from the south," Bjorn replied, his voice carrying the flat tone he used when discussing military matters. "Harald Bloodaxe's ships have been seen in the coastal waters, moving north along the trading routes. His raids have been more organized this season, more purposeful." The name sent a chill through Ingrid that had nothing to do with the autumn. Harald Bloodaxe was known throughout the northern territories as a ruthless leader who combined Viking brutality with strategic intelligence. Unlike the disorganized bands of young raiders who occasionally threatened isolated settlements, Harald commanded a fleet of experienced warriors who struck with devastating precision. "How far south?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. 3 days' ride, perhaps 4 if the weather holds them back. But Ingrid, Bjorn paused, and she saw something in his expression that went beyond concern for village defenses. The messenger brought more than warnings about raids. He carried this. From inside his cloak, Bjorn withdrew a piece of parchment that had been folded and sealed with wax. The seal bore a mark that Ingrid did not recognize, but Bjorn's reaction to it suggested familiarity of the most unpleasant kind. "What is it?" she asked, though the careful way he handled the document told her it contained nothing good. "A message directed specifically at me," Bjorn said, breaking the seal with deliberate movements. "From someone who should not know where to find me." He read the contents in silence, his face growing darker with each line. When he finished, he stood motionless for a long moment before finally speaking. "It is from Gunnar Eriksson," he said, and the name fell into the room like a stone dropped into still water. "My cousin. Eric's brother." The blood-stained letter in Bjorn's hands seemed to pulse with malevolent life, carrying news that transformed their peaceful existence into something far more dangerous. Ingrid felt her world shifting beneath her feet as she realized that the past Bjorn had tried to leave behind was reaching out to reclaim him. "I thought all of Eric's family died in the same battle," she said carefully. "Gunnar was not with us when we sailed south," Bjorn replied, his voice carrying the weight of old guilt. "He stayed behind to manage the clan's interests at home. When news of our destruction reached him, he must have assumed I was dead along with the rest. But now he knows you survived. Now he knows, and he is coming to finish what his brother started." Bjorn looked up from the letter, his pale eyes holding depths of weariness that spoke of battles fought and refought in memory. "He blames me for Eric's death, claims I murdered his brother for personal gain rather than justice. In his version of events, I am the traitor who destroyed our clan from within." Ingrid moved closer, drawn by the need to offer whatever support she could in the face of this new threat. "What does he want?" "Single combat to settle the blood debt," Bjorn said simply. "Winner takes all honor, lands, the right to speak for our family's legacy. He gives me 3 days to prepare. Then he comes whether I am ready or not." The stark brutality of the challenge was typically Norse in its directness, but Ingrid could see the trap embedded within it. If Bjorn accepted, he risked death or serious injury. If he refused, he would be branded a coward, and Gunnar would be free to attack the village without any obligation to limit the violence to a formal duel. "There must be another way," she said, though even as she spoke, she knew how unlikely it was that Gunnar would accept any alternative to blood. "Men like Gunnar see the world in simple terms," Bjorn replied. "There is honor and dishonor, strength and weakness, victory and defeat. The complexities of truth do not interest them when they conflict with the story they have chosen to believe." As the implications of the challenge settled over them, Ingrid found herself thinking about the life they had built together, the careful partnership, the shared grief, the quiet contentment they had carved out of their separate losses. All of it now stood in jeopardy because of events that had occurred years before they even met. "You could refuse," she said, though she knew it was impossible even as the words left her lips. "And watch him burn the village to punish my cowardice? Let innocent people suffer for my past?" Bjorn shook his head. "I have run from this confrontation long enough. Perhaps it is time to face it directly." The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation that felt both urgent and surreal. Bjorn spent hours maintaining his weapons and armor, the familiar rituals of a warrior preparing for battle. But he also took time to complete practical tasks around the longhouse, repairing a loose shutter, ensuring their winter supplies were properly stored, reviewing their household accounts with the thoroughness of a man who might not return to manage such details. Ingrid found herself caught between the desire to help and the frustration of having no useful role to play in preparations for single combat. Her skills lay in healing rather than warfare, in teaching rather than fighting. But as she watched Mayan systematically prepare for what might be his death, she realized that her greatest contribution might be simply being present, offering the steady support of someone who valued him beyond his prowess as a warrior. "Whatever happens," she said on the second evening, as they sat together by the fire in what might be their last quiet moment, "I want you to know that this year with you has been the happiest of my adult life." Bjorn looked up from the sword he was sharpening, his expression softening in the way that was reserved for her alone. "Even considering our losses?" "Especially considering our losses," Ingrid replied. "Grief shared is different from grief carried. Alone, you taught me that." He set aside his weapon and reached for her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "If I do not survive this, you will," she interrupted, unable to bear hearing him speak of defeat. "If I do not survive," he continued gently but firmly, "I need you to know that marrying you was the best decision I have made since returning to these shores. You gave me peace when I thought I would carry rage to my grave. You showed me that building could be more satisfying than destroying. Whatever time we have had together, it has been worth everything that came before." Tears blurred Ingrid's vision, but she forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. "Then you must win, Bjorn Eriksson, because I am not finished learning from you, and I am not ready to say goodbye." The morning of the third day dawned clear and cold, with a wind that carried the scent of snow from the distant mountains. The village square had been cleared to create a fighting ground, and despite the early hour, most of Ravensgard's population had gathered to witness the confrontation that would determine their fate. Along with Bjorn's, Gunnar Eriksson arrived, precisely at midday, leading a small party of warriors who arranged themselves around the edge of the fighting space with military precision. He was a younger version of the man Ingrid remembered seeing in Erik, tall and lean where Bjorn was broad, with the same red-gold hair and pale eyes that marked their shared bloodline, but where Bjorn carried himself with the controlled strength of experience. Gunnar moved with the aggressive confidence of youth convinced of its own righteousness. "Cousin," Gunnar called across the square, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "You look well for a dead man." "I live," Bjorn replied simply, stepping forward in full battle gear. "As you can see." "Yes, you live while better men lie in foreign graves," Gunnar said, his words designed to provoke. "Tell me, Kinslayer, how does it feel to prosper from your brother's blood?" Ingrid watched from the edge of the crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs as she witnessed the formal exchange that preceded combat. This was ritual as much as battle, the playing out of grievances that had festered for years in the absence of resolution. "I grieve for them every day," Bjorn said, and there was no defensiveness in his tone, only the steady sadness of truth. "But I will not accept guilt for Erik's treachery or responsibility for the choices that led to their deaths." "Then you will die for your pride," Gunnar snarled, drawing his sword with a flourish that spoke of recent practice as steel rang against steel in the first exchange of blows. Ingrid closed her eyes and prayed to whatever gods might be listening, that the man she loved had not finally met a fight he could not win. The clash of steel echoed across the village square as the two cousins circled each other with the deadly grace of experienced fighters. Ingrid forced herself to watch, despite every instinct screaming at her to look away, knowing that Bjorn might need to see her strength reflected in her face if his eyes found hers in the moments between attacks. Gunnar fought with the fluid aggression of youth, his blade moving in complex patterns designed to overwhelm through speed and unpredictability. But Bjorn met each assault with the patient defense of a veteran who had learned to conserve energy and wait for his opponent's inevitable mistakes. Their weapons sang together in a deadly duet, neither able to gain decisive advantage in the opening exchanges. "You fight like an old man," Gunnar taunted between attacks, his breathing still steady despite the intensity of their combat. "Have soft living and a farmer's wife made you weak?" Bjorn did not rise to the bait, his attention focused entirely on reading his opponent's movements and waiting for the opening that would end the fight. But Ingrid saw the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested Gunnar's words had found their mark, even if they failed to disrupt his tactical focus. The duel continued for long minutes that felt like hours, both men testing each other's strength and skill without committing to the kind of decisive strike that could end the contest. The villagers watched in tense silence, understanding that their own fate was being decided along with that of their protector. Then Gunnar landed, a glancing blow across Bjorn's shoulder, drawing first blood and sending a murmur of concern through the watching crowd. The wound was superficial, but it marked a shift in momentum that Gunnar pressed with renewed aggression. His attacks became more focused, more brutal, seeking to exploit what he perceived as a weakness in his older opponent's defense. Bjorn gave ground steadily, his movements still controlled, but betraying the first signs of strain. Ingrid found herself holding her breath with each exchange, her hands clenched so tightly that her nails drew blood from her palms. Around her, she could hear the whispered prayers and muttered curses of villagers whose survival depended on Bjorn's victory. Just as it seemed that Gunnar might overwhelm his opponent through sheer persistence, Bjorn shifted tactics. Instead of continuing to give ground, he stepped inside Gunnar's next attack, accepting a painful cut across his ribs in exchange for an opening that let him drive his pommel into his cousin's temple. The blow sent Gunnar staggering, his guard dropping just enough for Bjorn to follow up with a thrust that should have ended the fight. But Gunnar recovered faster than expected, deflecting the killing stroke and countering with a wild swing that forced Bjorn to leap backward. Both men stood breathing heavily now, blood streaming from multiple wounds, their earlier tactical patience giving way to the desperate aggression of fighters who understood that the contest was entering its final phase. "You cannot win, cousin," Gunnar gasped, wiping blood from a cut above his eye. "Even if you kill me here, Harald Bloodaxe comes behind me. I told him where to find you, promised him your head as payment for his support. You can defeat one enemy, but not an army." The revelation hit Ingrid like a physical blow. This duel was not the end of their troubles, but merely the beginning. Even if Bjorn survived the immediate threat, they would face the prospect of Harald's raiders descending on Ravensgard with the focused purpose of eliminating a specific target. But instead of despair, Gunnar's words seemed to fill Bjorn with new resolve. His posture straightened, and when he raised his sword again, there was something implacable in his manner that spoke of a man who had finally accepted the full scope of what he must do to protect those he loved. "Then I will defeat you quickly," Bjorn said quietly, "and prepare to face Harald with whatever time remains." The final exchange was brief and decisive. Gunnar lunged forward in a desperate all-or-nothing attack, betting everything on one perfect strike. But Bjorn was ready for him, sidestepping the thrust and bringing his own blade around in a horizontal arc that took Gunnar's head from his shoulders with surgical precision. The sudden silence that followed the killing blow was broken only by the sound of Gunnar's body hitting the ground and the collective exhale of breath from the watching villagers. Bjorn stood over his cousin's corpse, his sword dripping red in the afternoon light, looking more exhausted than triumphant. "It is finished," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the square. But even as he spoke, Ingrid could see in his face the knowledge that this victory had merely earned them time to prepare for a larger battle. The villagers pressed forward with congratulations and offers of aid for his wounds, but Bjorn waved them off with weary courtesy. His eyes found Ingrid across the crowd, and she saw in them the need for her presence more than any celebration of his martial prowess. She was beside him in moments, her healing supplies already in hand as she assessed the damage Gunnar's blade had inflicted. The cuts were painful, but not life-threatening, and her competent ministrations drew nods of approval from the village women who had gathered to witness her work. "How long do we have?" she asked quietly as she cleaned the wound on his shoulder. "Days, perhaps a week if the weather turns against them," Bjorn replied, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Harald moves fast when he has a specific target in mind." As word of Gunnar's revelation spread through the village, the initial relief of Bjorn's victory gave way to growing anxiety about the threat still approaching from the south. Jarl Magnus called for an immediate council meeting, and within the hour, every adult in Ravensgard had gathered in the great hall to discuss their options. "We could evacuate," suggested Tarl the merchant, his face pale with fear. "Take what?" We can carry and flee north until Harold loses interest in pursuing us. And go where? Countered Astrid the Weaver. This is our home, our livelihood. We cannot simply abandon everything we have built because of one man's vendetta. One man's vendetta backed by the most ruthless raider in the northern seas, Thorold replied sharply. Sometimes survival requires difficult choices. Bjorn listened to the debate with the patient attention of a military commander assessing his options. When the Jarl finally called for his opinion, he rose slowly, his bandaged wounds evident beneath his clean tunic. We cannot outrun Harold's ships, he said simply. He knows these waters as well as any of us, and his men are trained for pursuit. If we flee, he will hunt us down one by one, and we will face him scattered and weakened rather than united and prepared. Then you counsel us to fight? Asked Magnus, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. I counsel us to make our stand here, where we know the ground and can control the terms of engagement, Bjorn replied. But I will not lie to you about the odds. Harold commands experienced warriors, and they will not be easily defeated. The hall erupted in renewed debate as villagers argued the merits of various defensive strategies. Some favored building barricades and fighting from prepared positions. Others suggested attempting to negotiate, offering tribute in exchange for being left alone. A few hardy souls even proposed launching a preemptive attack, striking at Harold's ships before they could reach Ravensgard's harbor. Through it all, Ingrid watched her husband with growing admiration and concern. He was transforming before her. Eyes from the peaceful man she had married into the military leader his reputation suggested, shouldering the burden of command with the same quiet competence he brought to every challenge. When the formal council session ended, smaller groups continued the discussion in urgent whispers throughout the village. Parents debated whether to send their children away to safety. Craftsmen calculated how quickly they could turn farming tools into weapons. Women organized the sharing of medical supplies and food stores in preparation for a siege. That evening, as Ingrid and Bjorn sat together in their longhouse, the weight of leadership settled visibly on his shoulders. He had spent the afternoon inspecting the village's defenses, cataloging available weapons and assigning responsibilities to men who had never faced organized combat. The carved stones he used to demonstrate tactical formations covered their table, transformed from teaching aids into tools of war. You are carrying too much of this burden alone, Ingrid observed, watching him move the stones through various defensive configurations. It is what I know, Bjorn replied without looking up from his planning. Strategy, tactics, the management of men in combat. If these skills can protect Ravensgard, then I must use them. But you do not have to carry the entire responsibility by yourself, Ingrid insisted. Let others share the load according to their abilities. Bjorn finally looked up, his pale eyes reflecting both gratitude and exhaustion. What would you have me delegate? The knowledge of how Harold fights? The experience of command under pressure? These are not skills that can be quickly taught or easily shared. No, but leadership involves more than military expertise, Ingrid replied gently. You have spent months earning the respect and trust of these people. They will follow you not just because you are a famous warrior, but because they have seen your character in peaceful times. Use that trust to help them find their own courage. Her words seemed to reach something deep within him, and gradually the tension in his shoulders began to ease. You are right, he said finally. I have been thinking like a mercenary captain, rather than a member of this community. These people deserve to fight for their own homes, rather than simply following orders from someone they barely know. The realization marked a subtle but important shift in his approach to the coming battle. Instead of trying to control every aspect of the defense himself, Bjorn began delegating responsibilities based on individual strengths and local knowledge. The blacksmith took charge of weapons production and repair. The fisherman planned ways to use their boats for reconnaissance and harassment. The women organized medical care and supply management. As the preparations continued into the night, Ingrid found herself thinking about the carved cradle that still sat in their sleeping chamber. The child who should have slept there would never know the safety his parents were fighting to preserve, but perhaps other children would benefit from their efforts. In protecting Ravsgard, they were protecting not just their own future, but the futures of all the families who called this place home. The unity banner that the villagers hastily sewed that night combined symbols from different families into a single design, representing their commitment to stand together against the coming storm. It was crude compared to the formal banners of established clans, but it carried meaning that went beyond artistic merit, proof that necessity and shared purpose could forge bonds as strong as blood. Harald Bloodaxe's ships appeared on the horizon 3 days later, their black sails cutting through the morning mist like harbingers of doom. From the watchtower that overlooked the fjord, the lookout's horn sounded the warning that sent every villager to their assigned positions with the speed of long practice. Ingrid had spent those 3 days transforming their longhouse into a field hospital, gathering supplies and preparing spaces for the wounded she knew would come. Her father's knowledge of healing herbs became precious, beyond gold, as she mixed poultices and prepared tinctures that might mean the difference between life and death for men who had never faced organized warfare. 5 ships, reported young Magnus, who had been serving as a runner between the watchtower and the village center. Maybe 60 men total, all armed for serious fighting. Bjorn received the intelligence with the calm focus of a commander who had prepared for this moment. Since Gunnar's challenge arrived, the defensive positions they had constructed over the past days, earthworks blocking the main approaches, concealed pits along likely attack routes, stockpiled weapons at strategic points, represented the best they could accomplish with limited time and resources. Send word to the harbor positions, he instructed Magnus. Fire arrows on my signal, not before. And remind Thorald's group that their job is harassment, not heroic stands. We need them alive and mobile. The boy nodded and sprinted away, part of the communication network that would allow coordinated response despite the village's scattered defensive positions. Watching him go, Ingrid felt a surge of pride in how completely the community had committed to this desperate enterprise. Harold's ships entered the harbor with arrogant confidence, their crews making no attempt at stealth or surprise. These were experienced raiders who had faced organized resistance before and found it wanting. Their leader stood in the prow of the lead vessel, his presence commanding attention. Even at distance, Ingrid had heard descriptions of Harald Bloodaxe, but seeing him in person was still shocking. He was not the giant she had expected, but rather a man of average height whose authority seemed to radiate from sheer force of personality. Even from across the water, his pale eyes seemed to find and assess every aspect of Ravsgard's defenses, with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating prey. There, Bjorn said quietly, pointing toward the second ship. See the man in the red cloak? That is Ragnar One-Eye, Harald's lieutenant. He's the real danger. Harald plans the campaigns, but Ragnar executes them. The landing proceeded with military precision, boats moving in coordinated waves that deposited armed men at carefully chosen points along the shoreline. Within minutes, Harald had 60 warriors on solid ground, formed into tactical units that could support each other while maintaining flexibility for changing conditions. Bjorn had anticipated this approach, positioning his own forces to take advantage of the raiders' initial vulnerability during the landing phase. At his signal, arrows began falling among the invasion force, followed by stones hurled from concealed positions along the harbor ridge. The attack disrupted Harald's formations, but did not break them. His men responded with disciplined professionalism, raising shields to deflect projectiles while their own archers returned fire at the village positions. Several villagers cried out as arrows found their marks, and Ingrid felt her heart clench at the sound of familiar voices raised in pain. "First, casualties coming in," called Astrid the Weaver, who was helping coordinate the medical response. Two men stumbled into the longhouse, one supporting the other, who clutched a shaft protruding from his shoulder. Ingrid's hands moved without conscious thought, guided by training that had lain dormant for years. She cut away the wounded man's shirt, assessed the angle of penetration, and began the delicate work of extraction. The arrow had missed major blood vessels, but the wound would need careful cleaning to prevent infection. "Hold still, Olsen," she murmured to the injured fisherman. "This will hurt, but it must come out cleanly." As she worked, she could hear the sounds of battle intensifying outside. Shouts of command, the clash of weapons, the distinctive whistle of arrows in flight, all the chaotic noise of men fighting desperately for survival. Each sound seemed to carry the possibility that Bjorn might be hurt or killed, but she forced herself to focus on the patient before her, rather than fears she could not control. The wound cleaned and bandaged, she moved to the next casualty, a young man whose left arm hung at an unnatural angle, clearly broken by the impact of a war hammer. As she splinted the injury with practiced efficiency, more wounded began arriving in steady stream that spoke of fierce fighting throughout the village. "How does it go?" she asked Eric the blacksmith, who had brought in a companion with a deep gash across his thigh. "Hard to say," Eric replied honestly. "We are making them pay for every step, but they keep coming. Bjorn has them fighting on ground of our choosing, but Harold's men know their business." Through the longhouse windows, Ingrid could see smoke rising from several points in the village, whether from fire arrows or deliberate burning. She could not tell. The battle was spreading beyond the initial defensive positions, suggesting that Harald's forces had penetrated deeper into Ravnsgard than the original plan had anticipated. A tremendous crash shook the building, followed by sounds of splintering wood and shouted curses. Something heavy had struck the wall near the kitchen, and Ingrid realized with growing alarm that the fighting had reached their immediate neighborhood. "Bar the doors," she told Astrid urgently, "and prepare to move the wounded if necessary. This position may not hold." The door exploded inward with a crash that sent splinters flying across the main room. Three of Harald's warriors burst through the opening, their weapons bloody and their eyes wild with battle fury. Behind them, Ingrid could see the smoke and chaos of a village under siege, buildings burning and bodies scattered across ground that had been peaceful just hours before. "The wounded!" Astrid screamed, throwing herself between the raiders and the injured villagers who lay helpless on makeshift pallets. Ingrid's mind went crystalline with clarity born of desperate necessity. The large carving knife from her kitchen preparations lay within reach, and she seized it without conscious thought, placing herself between the invaders and her patients with the fierce protectiveness of a mother defending her young. "You want them, you go through me," she said, a voice steady despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her rational mind. The lead raider laughed, raising his axe with casual confidence. "One woman with a kitchen blade? This will be quick." But he had underestimated both her desperation and her knowledge of anatomy. When he lunged forward, expecting easy victory, Ingrid moved with precision learned from years of careful healing work. Her blade found the gap between his ribs with surgical accuracy, sliding between armor plates to pierce his heart with a single, decisive thrust. The man's eyes widened in shock as he realized he was dying, killed by someone he had dismissed as helpless. He collapsed at her feet, his blood spreading across the clean rushes she had laid down for her patients. The second raider hesitated, suddenly uncertain about the opposition he faced. That moment of doubt cost him dearly as Eric the blacksmith. Wounded but far from helpless, swung a heavy iron poker into his skull with bone-crushing force. The third man turned to flee, only to find Bjorn filling the doorway behind him. Bjorn's father's war axe, the ancestral weapon that represented both his violent heritage and his duty to protect, took the raider's head with a single stroke that spoke of years of battlefield experience. "Ingrid!" Bjorn's voice carried relief, concern, and something like awe as he took in the scene, his wife standing over a dead enemy, her healing hands stained with blood shed in defense of the helpless. "Are you hurt?" she asked, moving toward him with the same efficiency she brought to all crises. "Scratches only," he replied, though she could see deeper wounds that would need attention once the immediate danger passed. "The battle?" "Turning," Bjorn said grimly. "Harold underestimated our resolve, but he adapts quickly. He has pulled back to regroup, and when he attacks again, it will be with everything he has." Through the broken doorway, Ingrid could see the Unity banner still flying from the village center, its hastily sewn symbols defiant despite the smoke and destruction surrounding it. The sight filled her with fierce pride in what their community had accomplished, even as she understood that their greatest test still lay ahead. "How many have we lost?" she asked, dreading the answer. "7 dead, twice that number wounded but alive," Bjorn replied. "Harald has lost more, but he can afford the losses better than we can." The mathematics of attrition were brutal, and simple Harold could trade 2 men for every villager and still achieve victory. But something in Bjorn's manner suggested he had found a way to change those calculations. "You have a plan," Ingrid observed, reading the subtle shift in his posture that spoke of renewed purpose. "I have an opportunity," Bjorn corrected. "Harold's arrogance has made him predictable. What did you, ma? He expects us to huddle behind our defenses and wait for his final assault. Instead, we are going to attack." The audacity of the proposal took Ingrid's breath away. Their entire strategy had been built around the premise that they lacked the numbers and experience for offensive action. But as Bjorn quickly outlined his intentions, she began to see the desperate logic behind his decision. "Ragnar One-Eye commands Harold's reserve force," Bjorn explained. 20 men held back to exploit any breakthrough or pursue fleeing enemies. They are positioned in the old grain storage area, confident in their security. If we can eliminate them, Harold loses both his tactical flexibility and his most experienced lieutenant. "And you think you can reach them undetected?" "I think we have to try," Bjorn replied simply. "If we wait for Harold's next assault, we will be overwhelmed. This is our only chance to seize the initiative." As he spoke, other villagers began gathering around their makeshift command postmen and women, who had proven their courage in the first phase of fighting and were ready to risk everything on one desperate gamble. The transformation was remarkable. Farmers and fishermen who had never imagined themselves as warriors now carried themselves with the quiet confidence of people who had discovered their own strength under pressure. "I need 6 volunteers," Bjorn announced. "This will be dangerous beyond anything we have faced so far, and I cannot promise that anyone who comes with me will survive." Every hand in the room went up immediately, and Ingrid felt tears sting her eyes at the display of loyalty and determination. These were her neighbors, her students' parents, people who had watched her teach their children and share meals at community gatherings. Now they were prepared to die following her husband into battle against overwhelming odds. Bjorn selected his volunteers with the careful consideration of a commander who understood that each choice carried the weight of a life. Magnus, the young runner, whose speed and knowledge of the village layout made him invaluable for reconnaissance. Eric, the blacksmith, wounded but mobile, whose strength with improvised weapons had already proven decisive. 4 others whose skills and courage had marked them during the defensive fighting. "What do you need from me?" Ingrid asked, though she already knew the answer would involve staying behind to tend the wounded. Keep them alive, Bjorn said, gesturing toward the injured villagers who filled their longhouse. And if we fail, lead the evacuation to the northern hills. Do not let Harold take prisoners. The weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. In a matter of hours, she had transformed from teacher to healer to warrior to potential leader of survivors. Each role had demanded strengths she had not known she possessed, and now she faced the possibility of bearing sole responsibility for what remained of their community. Bjorn kissed her then, hard and desperate, a farewell that carried the possibility of finality. "I love you," he whispered against her lips. "Whatever happens, remember that this year with you has been worth everything. Come back to me," she whispered in return. "We still have a life to build together." Then he was gone, leading his small strike force into the smoky chaos of a village at war. Ingrid watched from the broken doorway until they disappeared into the maze of burning buildings and rubble-strewn streets. Carrying with them the hopes of everyone who remained behind, the Unity banner snapped in the wind above the village center, its crude stitching somehow more beautiful than the finest royal standard. It represented everything they were fighting for, not glory or conquest, but the simple right to live and love and raise children in the place they called home. 6 months later, Ingrid stood in the doorway of their rebuilt longhouse, watching the spring sun paint golden light across the village square where the decisive battle had been fought. The scars of that terrible day were still visible, scorched timber in the buildings that had burned, uneven patches in the cobblestones where blood had soaked deep into the earth. But life had returned to Ravensgard with the stubborn persistence of wildflowers growing through cracked stone. The attack on Ragnar One-Eye had succeeded beyond their most optimistic hopes. Bjorn's small force had struck with perfect timing, eliminating Harald's reserve just as the main assault began its final push. Deprived of his tactical flexibility and his most trusted lieutenant, Harald had found his overwhelming advantage transformed into a deadly trap as enraged villagers pressed their attack with the fury of people defending their homes. Harald himself had fallen to Bjorn's axe in single combat among the burning remains of the grain storage, their duel witnessed by survivors from both sides. With their leader dead and their force scattered, the surviving raiders had fled to their ships, leaving Ravensgard bloodied but victorious. The new hearthstone that Bjorn and Ingrid had placed together in their home was carved from local granite, its surface smooth and warm beneath her hand as she traced the intricate patterns that told the story of their survival. It anchored not just their dwelling, but their commitment to each other and to the community they had helped preserve. "The bread smells ready," Bjorn called from the kitchen, his voice carrying the contentment of a man who had found peace with his place in the world. Ingrid smiled, placing her hand over the gentle swell of her belly where their second child grew, strong and healthy. This pregnancy felt different from the first, less desperate hope than quiet confidence, the natural result of love that had been tested by loss and proven durable. She was 4 months along now, past the dangerous early period, and both the village midwife and her own healing knowledge suggested that this child would come safely to term. "Coming," she replied, taking one last look at the square, where children were playing the same games her students had always enjoyed. Some were the same children who had hidden in fear during the battle. Others were newer arrivals, families drawn to Ravensgard by stories of a community that had stood against overwhelming odds and emerged stronger for the experienced in the kitchen. Bjorn was pulling fresh loaves from the oven with the careful attention he brought to all domestic tasks. The simple act of making bread had become a kind of meditation for him, a daily reminder that his hands could create as well as destroy. The wooden training sword he had carved still sat in the corner, now joined by others, as he had begun teaching combat skills to any villager who wanted to learn. 3 more families arrived this morning, he reported, setting the bread on the cooling rack. The baker's family from Erikstad and 2 farming households from the southern settlements. They have heard that Ravensgard offers opportunities for people willing to work hard and defend their neighbors. The growth had been steady since word of their victory had spread through the northern territories. People seeking security and community were drawn to a place that had proven its commitment to protecting its own. The population had nearly doubled, bringing new skills and energy that strengthened the village in ways that went beyond mere numbers. And the Jarl's response? Ingrid asked, though she already knew the answer would be positive. Magnus has agreed to expand the charter. Bjorn replied with satisfaction. Ravensgard will become an official settlement with rights to self-governance and trade. We are no longer just a fishing village dependent on others' protection. The recognition represented more than legal status and acknowledged that their community had earned the right to determine its own destiny. The courage they had shown in defending their homes had transformed them from subjects seeking protection into citizens capable of providing it for themselves and others. That afternoon, as had become their custom, Ingrid and Bjorn walked together through the expanding village, observing the changes that each day brought. New houses were rising to accommodate the growing population, built with the same attention to both beauty and defense that had characterized the reconstruction efforts. The school had been expanded to handle twice as many students, and Ingrid had begun training 2 younger women to help with the teaching load. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked as they paused beside the small memorial that honored the villagers who had died in the battle. The peaceful life we might have had if Harold had never come? Bjorn considered the question with the thoughtfulness she had learned to value in him. "I regret the losses," he said finally. "Every name on that stone represents a friend whose future was cut short. But I do not regret learning that our love was strong enough to survive the testing, or discovering that this community had the courage to stand together when survival demanded it." Their evening routine had evolved to include time spent working on the tapestry that would tell their children the story of how their parents had found each other and built a life worth defending. The loom threads had grown into a complex narrative that captured not just the dramatic moments of battle and loss, but the quieter victories of daily partnership and shared purpose, thought as the sun set over the fjord, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson. Ingrid felt the child move within her, a gentle flutter that spoke of life determined to flourish, despite the world's uncertainties. This baby would grow up in a community that had proven its strength, raised by parents who understood both the fragility and the resilience of love. "What shall we call this one?" Bjorn asked, his large hand resting gently on her belly. "Something hopeful," Ingrid replied. "A name that speaks of the future rather than the past." The village children were gathering in the square for their evening games, their laughter echoing off the rebuilt walls of their homes. Watching them, Ingrid saw not just her current students, but the generations that would follow, children who would learn to read and write in the expanded school, who would grow up strong and confident in a place that valued both knowledge and courage, who would carry forward the legacy of a community that had chosen to stand together when standing apart meant extinction. The new hearthstone beneath their feet was more than mere decoration. It was a foundation for the family they were, the building and the life they would share. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, as all tomorrows did, but they would face them together, anchored by love that had been tested by loss and proven unbreakable dot in the distance. The Unity banner still flew above the village center, its colors bright against the evening sky. It no longer looked crude or hastily made, but had acquired the dignity that came from representing something real and enduring. Like the marriage it symbolized, and the community it protected, and the love it celebrated, it had been forged in crisis and proven worthy of the faith placed in it. The hearth was warm, the bread was fresh, and the future stretched ahead full of promise. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything